The Missing Layer in Modern Medical Education No. 1514, VPT 071, January 26, 2026. Gerald C. EclaireMD Foundation. Category: Medical Education. Introduction. Modern medical education has achieved extraordinary success in many areas. Anatomy is taught with remarkable precision. Biochemistry and molecular biology have advanced at a breathtaking pace. Pharmacology has produced powerful therapeutic tools that can save lives when used appropriately. Clinical training emphasizes pattern recognition, differential diagnosis, evidence-based guidelines, and increasingly sophisticated imaging and laboratory technologies. Over the past several decades, diagnostic resolution, surgical techniques, and interventional procedures have all improved dramatically. Yet despite all of this progress, a fundamental gap remains. This gap is not due to a lack of knowledge in biology or chemistry. Instead, it reflects the absence of a coherent framework for understanding how disease evolves over time inside an individual human body. Current medical education remains largely organized around snapshots, thresholds, averages, statistics, and categorical labels, rather than trajectories, accumulation, progressive damage, and failure dynamics. I often think of modern science and medicine as a large structure supported by several foundational columns. Traditionally, these columns are mathematics, physics, chemistry, and biology. A structure supported by all four columns is stable and resilient. If one column is missing, the structure may still stand under normal conditions, but its stability is compromised. With only two columns, a structure may look solid, but it has little resistance to sideways forces. Wind, vibration, shifting loads, or sudden impact do not push straight down. They strike from the side. Without adequate lateral support, the structure begins to wobble, drift, and gradually weaken. It may stand for years under normal conditions, yet a single unexpected stress can trigger deformation or collapse. What appeared stable was, in reality, vulnerable the entire time. This is precisely what we observe in medicine today. Biology and chemistry together form the core of modern biomedicine and can support routine diagnosis and treatment. However, when disease progression involves long-term accumulation, nonlinear stress, or sudden catastrophic failure, the absence of strong mathematical and physical foundations becomes evident. The structure does not fail because biology is wrong, but because critical supporting columns were never fully built into the system. Therefore, the missing layer is mathematics and physics. Medicine today explains what is happening in the body, but too often fails to explain how fast it is happening, why it accelerates, why it becomes irreversible, or why catastrophic events appear to occur suddenly after long periods of apparent stability. These are not biochemical questions alone. They are time domain and nonlinear structure domain questions. I believe this gap can be addressed by adding a parallel math-physics-based training track within the current biochemistry-emphasized medical curriculum. This proposed track is intended to complement, not replace, existing medical education. It would not remove anatomy, physiology, pathology, or pharmacology. Instead, it would provide future physicians with tools to integrate these disciplines into a broader, coherent, time-aware, system-level understanding of complex and often deadly diseases. Why statistics alone is not enough. At present, most quantitative training in medicine is limited to statistics. While statistics is useful for population studies, epidemiology, and clinical trials, it is poorly suited for understanding individual disease progression. Statistical methods emphasize averages, correlations, regressions, confidence intervals, and cross-sectional comparisons. They are designed to describe groups, not evolving systems or individual patient trajectories. Disease, however, does not progress as an average. It progresses within a single body, under continuous stress, with memory, hysteresis, fatigue, delayed failure, and sometimes sudden collapse. A patient does not suffer a stroke, heart attack, kidney failure, or dementia because they crossed a statistical threshold. These events occur because damage accumulated quietly over years until structural or functional reserve was exhausted. Mathematical foundations for trajectory-based medicine in the mathematics domain. Students entering this parallel training track should receive systematic instruction that extends well beyond statistics. For students coming from liberal arts or purely biological backgrounds, this training must be carefully structured and progressive rather than abrupt. The starting point should be calculus. Calculus teaches how quantities change over time, not just how large they are at a single moment. This is essential for understanding rates of deterioration, acceleration of risk, and the difference between slow drift and rapid collapse. Without calculus, time remains an abstract concept. With calculus, time becomes measurable, interpretable, and actionable. Linear algebra should follow, as it provides the language for multivariable systems. Human physiology is never driven by a single factor. Glucose, blood pressure, lipids, diet, inflammation, sleep, stress, and physical activity interact continuously. Linear algebra teaches how these variables combine, reinforce, compensate, or oppose one another. It also prepares students to think in vectors, spaces, and projections rather than isolated laboratory values or data points. Set theory may appear abstract, but it plays a critical conceptual role. It teaches classification, inclusion, exclusion, and boundary definition. Many medical diagnoses are, in reality, poorly defined sets with fuzzy borders. Learning set theory helps physicians understand why diagnostic categories overlap, why edge cases matter, and why rigid cutoffs often fail in real clinical practice. More advanced mathematical tools are required to model real biological behavior. Partial differential equations provide a natural framework for describing processes that change across both time and space, such as diffusion, perfusion, metabolic regulation, and inflammation. Another specific example is oxygen diffusion in tissue and glucose transport across membranes. They help explain how local dysfunction propagates through a system, why regional damage can lead to global failure, and how chronic metabolic disorders eventually transform into mortality diseases. Complex variables introduce oscillatory behavior, feedback loops, and stability analysis. Many physiological systems oscillate, including body weight, heart rate, blood pressure, glucose, hormones, sleep cycles, and emotional stress responses. Circadian rhythms or autonomic oscillations are also intuitive. Examples: complex variable thinking helps physicians understand why feedback stabilizes a system under one condition and destabilizes it under another. Topology is perhaps the most underappreciated yet most powerful mathematical tool in this context. Topology focuses on shape, continuity, and connectivity rather than precise numerical values. In medicine, topology enables recognition of disease progression patterns, failure pathways, and structural vulnerabilities without relying solely on thresholds. Topology helps identify failure pathways even when numerical values vary widely. Traditionally, topology has been applied mainly to medical imaging such as MRI. In my 70+ medical research papers, I have extended its application to pathophysiological behavior analysis, using topology to study disease evolution itself rather than static images. Physics and engineering as the language of damage and failure. Mathematics alone is not sufficient. Disease is not only a numerical process. It has physical causes and physical consequences. Engineers routinely predict failure decades before it happens, whereas medicine often detects failure only after it occurs. In the physics and engineering domain, students should be trained to think in terms of forces, deformation, energy accumulation, and failure. The human body is a physical structure subjected to mechanical, hydraulic, and metabolic stresses from birth to death. Elasticity and plasticity are foundational concepts. Elastic behavior describes reversible change. Plastic behavior describes permanent damage. This distinction maps directly onto early-stage versus late-stage disease. Early metabolic stress may be reversible through lifestyle modification. Late-stage disease often reflects structural damage that cannot be undone. For example, my recent stroke resulted from long-term diabetes-induced microvascular calcification in the brain, a largely irreversible process, combined with an acute hypertensive spike of 175 mmHg that triggered vessel rupture near the Pontine region. Without a physical damage framework, physicians may underestimate timing, reversibility, and urgency. Statics and dynamics teach the difference between equilibrium and motion. A patient can appear stable while damage is still accumulating. Dynamics explains why a system can tolerate stress for years and then fail abruptly. This is particularly relevant for vascular disease, stroke, chronic kidney disease, and neurodegenerative dementia, where long silent periods precede sudden clinical events. Linear and nonlinear modeling are both essential. Linear models are useful for small deviations and early disease stages. Nonlinear models explain tipping points, runaway processes, and sudden collapse. Most serious medical events occur in the nonlinear regime, where linear intuition fails. Strength of materials, structural fatigue, and rupture provide a powerful framework for understanding chronic disease. Blood vessels stiffen, bones weaken, tissues lose compliance, and organs fatigue under repeated stress. Failure is rarely due to a single insult. It results from cumulative microdamage that eventually exceeds tolerance. Modern physics should be introduced conceptually, not mathematically. The goal is intuition, structural mechanics involving beams, columns, plates, shells, and geometric forms are directly relevant to organs, vessels, skeletal structures, and even cellular architecture. The body is not only a biochemical reactor, it is a structure that bears load, resists pressure, and channels flow. Knowledge from both solid mechanics, which explains late-stage collapse, and fluid dynamics, which explains metabolic progression, is essential. Simple mortality statistics alone provide little insight into causation. Integration rather than replacement of biomedicine. It is critical to emphasize that math-physical medicine does not replace biochemical medicine. On the contrary, it depends on it and completes it. Without integration, the medical field risks falling behind fields such as aerospace, military systems, high technology, and artificial intelligence, all of which rely heavily on math-physics-based modeling. Physiology explains function, pathology explains injury and disease. Disease mechanisms provide biological causality. These disciplines remain essential and mandatory. What must change is how they are connected and interpreted. Physiology should be taught alongside physical constraints and time evolution. Pathology should be framed as accumulated damage rather than static description. Disease mechanisms should be embedded within a structural and temporal system context. Biochemistry explains what happens. Mathematics explains how fast it happens. Physics explains why it becomes irreversible. If I explicitly state in another way that biochemistry explains mechanism, mathematics explains trajectory, and physics explains structural consequence, this triad may be more memorable for readers. Preparing physicians for clinical practice and medical research. After completing this additional mathematical and physical training layer, students enter clinical practice and research with a fundamentally different mindset. Clinically, disease is no longer viewed as binary normal versus abnormal. Physicians see trajectories and patterns. Early warning signs appear long before guideline thresholds are crossed. Current guidelines, largely based on statistics, often lack depth for individual prediction. Physicians will understand why patients with identical diagnoses experience very different outcomes. In medical research, physicians move beyond correlation toward mechanism, structure, energy, connectivity, and causality. Outliers are no longer dismissed. In fact, outliers often represent mortality risk and deserve the highest attention rather than being averaged away. Most importantly, physicians can explain disease prevention, progression, and control to patients in clear and practical terms. They can explain not only what a lab value means today, but where it is heading, why it is changing, and what can still be done before reversal becomes impossible. This educational approach does not create a new medicine. It restores a missing dimension. It reconnects medicine with time, structure, and physical reality, expanding its scope and deepening its insight. Ultimately, it serves patients better. Conclusion: the ideas presented in this article are based entirely on my 17 years of self-study and research in medicine. The first 10 years were devoted to intensive learning of physiology, pathology, diseases, health, mortalities, and lifestyle details, followed by an additional 7 years of focused research with continuous application, testing, validation, and over 1,500 medical research paper writing. I fully recognize that my perspective may carry some personal bias. My goal is not to present a definitive answer, but to offer what I have learned as a possible contribution to future medical education and practice. How biochemical medicine and math-physical medicine should ultimately be integrated is not for me to decide. That responsibility belongs to future generations of medical educators, researchers, and clinicians. My role is simply to identify a missing dimension and explain why it matters. Surgery already demonstrates this integration. Surgical practice combines formal medical education with hands-on operational experience. It is neither purely theoretical nor purely empirical. Similarly, internal medicine can benefit greatly from math-physical medicine by gaining deeper insight into disease progression, structural damage, and long-term health trajectories. Introducing math-physical medical training does not conflict with current clinical practice or medical research. My own 17-year experience has demonstrated this. On the contrary, it strengthens judgment, precision, and long-term decision-making. Ultimately, medicine exists to serve humanity. This humanitarian principle, taught to me by my father, a surgeon nearly 100 years ago, remains the moral foundation of my work. Math-physical medicine should therefore be viewed not as a replacement, but as a natural and necessary extension of modern medical education, especially for disciplines involving long-term stress, cumulative damage, and structural failure. My 17-year medical journey is itself a case study demonstrating the power of math-physical thinking when applied to chronic metabolic disorders and the many mortality diseases they induce. Epilogue: I could only write this article at this stage of my life, after 17 years of continuous learning, reflection, and research in medicine. Writing it earlier would have been premature, and writing it later might have meant never writing it at all. I am now 79 years old, and the timing feels right, yet limited. This work is not the result of a single idea or theory, but of long observation, lived experience, and gradual synthesis across multiple disciplines. I do not claim that this perspective is complete or universally correct. I do believe, however, that it reflects something real and missing in current medical thinking. If this article helps future educators, clinicians, or researchers see disease more clearly in terms of time, structure, and progression, then it has served its purpose. My perspective emerged not only from study and research but from survival my own body as laboratory teacher and test case. Disclaimer: I write this paper not for fame, but to share what I have learned so others can understand their health, prevent disease, and live longer, healthier lives. This content is provided for educational reference only and does not constitute medical advice. No doctor-patient relationship is created. You may share this summary freely, but it must not be altered or republished as your own. All intellectual property rights belong to the author, Gerald C. HSU. This content is provided for educational reference only and does not constitute medical advice. No doctor-patient relationship is created. You may share this summary freely, but it must not be altered, edited, or republished as your own. All intellectual property rights and copyrights for this article and its related materials belong to the author, Gerald C.